and welcome to this home edition of Politics Today. And in this programme today, we will be discussing the G7 conference that took place in London, hosted by our own Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, which shows Britain's credentials on the global scene. So in this programme today, I'm joined by Dave Burlees, who was the former UK Director of Intercessors for Britain and is a Christian political commentator, together with Paul Diamond, one of this country's leading Christian barristers. So gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Paul, just want to get your thoughts, because this is the first G7 summit to take place with foreign ministers of the G7 for over 2 years. And this is the first post-Brexit G7 summit that Britain has the presidency of. What are your thoughts on this G7 summit that Britain is actually hosting?
Well, I think it needs to be stated that Britain needs to re-emphasize its international role, and we still have a very important international role. There's a tendency of our own national media and the European Union, especially during Brexit, we're finished, we're nothing, we can't survive on our own. Nothing could be further from the truth. Britain is a major international power, both in economic terms and military terms. In fact, we're one of the few European countries that can sustain overseas military operations at quite a high level. We're chairing the G7, that's very important. Biden, when he made his first international call upon being elected to a world leader, he phoned the British Prime Minister up, not the EU, not the Japanese, not the Canadian, but the British Prime Minister. And of course, he did that because of the importance of the special relationship. And I think that special relationship is going to be very important. It's going to rebond in the next few years. And I think it's going to be important for the difficulties the international community is going to face.
And Dave, good to have you back on your programme. I think this G7 summit that Britain is hosting is especially important, particularly since this is the first G summit that Britain is not only hosting but attending, and that we are no longer in the European Union. So this is an opportunity for Britain, isn't it, to show her leadership credentials on a global stage?
Yeah, like Paul said, it's we've often written ourselves off as not important, or as he says, the media's written us off as not important anymore. But again, our place in the world is important. We have a role to play. Unfortunately, our role isn't always used for good as it used to be. We've not used our special relationship for good as it used to be. Both the weakness of the UK and the US in foreign relations, as we've taken backward steps, obviously militarily, but in some ways politically, wanted to not be the leaders that we once were, and not used our values that we were famous for, and that I think is a shame. But we're encouraged by some of the noises from Boris Johnson, Dominic Raab, who have recovered something of that. We've now stronger in a position where we don't have someone answering for us. We don't have a foreign minister for the EU making our decisions for us and speaking for us, and that's a great opportunity for us to use our own voice and to use it for good in the world, and to stand up where the EU is failing to stand up on these international issues, whether China, Russia, Iran, or some of the smaller conflicts in Myanmar, and so on. So there's a real opportunity for us as hosts as well to set the agenda and set the pace. But time will tell as to how and what we do, and how strong it is, and whether we can take nations with us, rather than just hoping and encouraging and being a talk shop, as so often these things are.
Absolutely. And just a reminder to our viewers that the G7 countries that were represented in London were from France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada, the US, and the EU. and the big G7 summit is due to be held in Cornwall in June, where the world leaders will meet together to decide the fate of the world. Paul, just when actually reading kind of news reports, that this should have been a much bigger story than it actually was. It should have had a lot more news coverage than it actually did. And we see that really one of the main topics of discussion at the G7 was how to deal with China, recognition of the economic ties that need for cooperation on health and climate change. But there seemed to be very much fudging the issue of China. If we remember back to last year, the Australian government wanted a national inquiry to take place about China's role with COVID-19. And the G7 seemed to be very reluctant to tackle and confront the Chinese. This is a slightly worrying aspect of this G7 summit, isn't it? Is it not?
Well, it is. I mean, China is a huge problem at the moment on every level. I mean, even if we take it at a basic level, I don't think it can be disputed that the virus originated from China, whether man-made or natural, and their duplicity in addressing the question and working with the World Health Organization caused a worldwide pandemic. At the least, there is some economic culpability on the Chinese, and there ought to be some form of debt cancellation because China is strangling many nations now with their debt bondage to it. And there is a total silence. I mean, in fact, the Chinese economy has made a mint out of this pandemic, producing many of the productions. They've been not seriously affected by it, and their economy is booming. Whereas many countries are going to second and third lockdowns after struggling for years. And we mentioned India, but you know, it's not just this pandemic, and people have separate views on it, the numbers and what they really are. But actually, the lockdown in countries like India, where people are daily wage laborers, it's crippling their economy and inflicting misery. So I think there is a culpability on the Chinese, but China is a real problem, and I can address that in more detail. But I don't think they can be confronted. I think they're too strong directly, and I think there has to be some united front of containment. It's very, very different from Russia. Russia was a second or third world country with a first world army, if I could put it that way, and they couldn't sustain that. So when the Reagan-Thatcher arms build-up commenced, they couldn't supply their armies. China's very different. It's a very modern economy, a very advanced army, and it needs different solutions.
No, absolutely. And Dave, what concerns me in particular is here's an opportunity for Britain to show real global leadership in the world, to highlight the very precarious situation that we're facing with Russian troops on the border of the Ukraine, Iran very close to developing nuclear weapons, and China's belligerence on the South China Seas. They are threatening to invade Taiwan. And so therefore, I think the American approach is we need to unify the entire G7 and maintain the international order so that we can meet the challenges posed by Iran, Russia, and China. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've seen with Iran recently the damage that's done when people seek to pacify strong leaders and dictators and authoritative regimes, and the result has been from our weakness further problems. It's not that we want to see us going all guns blazing, bombing the Middle East all over again, but the inability to act on particularly the matter of Iran, and our weakness of this treaty that we signed, the EU's, and we're still a part of, as Britain and EU, France, are still trying to resurrect this Iran deal, which is a weak deal that has permitted them to go further and further with no consequences. And when Trump's took a stand over the Iran, Iran deal, rather than backing and supporting him, the UK chose to take a stand with the EU in its compromised position. And so it's shown us really as a weak force in the world. And then, so when we come to China, and I think the rise of China and the rise of Russia, they see our weakness in Britain, they see our weakness from America and foreign policy, and they've taken the opportunity to push the boundaries to see how far they can go and what they can get away with. Iran, I don't think, would have done this under George Bush. They wouldn't have gone as far as this when they were under pressure from an American regime. But here we see China, Iran, Russia, these rogue states and dangerous nations being allowed to continue to go further and further, and all we do is talk, and all we say is, oh, this is a problem. We talk about it as a problem, but we have no solutions. And yet the trade, as this G7 event is particularly going to focus on trade, this is a real opportunity for us to really deal with China and to take our money elsewhere. And that would really hamper their economy. But we don't act. We've chosen not to act. We say that sanctions don't work. We say using our strength doesn't work. And yet what is proved is that when we fail to act, that these states go further and further, and all they understand is strength. And when we show our weakness, they progress.
And Paul, this is a quote from our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, regarding the G7 summit that took place yesterday with foreign leaders. He said that we believe in keeping trade open. We believe in standing up for open societies, for human rights and democracies. And we must believe in safeguarding and promoting public good, whether it is the environment, tackling climate change summit, and to deal with pandemics and public health more generally. What concerns me the most is, yes, climate change is a big issue, and it's a major problem, and we have a moral responsibility to look after our climate. But when this seems to be the number one issue that the United States, Britain, and the G7 summit are pushing, when we're seeing there are major geostrategic fault lines that need our focus and our attention, are we not in danger of actually weakening the West in a sense, and not being ready to meet the kind of global challenge posed by threats posed by Russia and China and a resurgent Iran?
I think you're right. I mean, it's an embarrassingly woke agenda that The Guardian would totally support, but many people in other political camps and reading lists would wonder, as you say, why are those the priorities? There is terrible, I agree, weakness in all these matters, and they're simply just not going to address politically incorrect matters. And the weakness thing, I couldn't help reflecting when you were talking about the weakness thing, when about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Turkey was letting millions pass through its borders. And the response of the EU was to pay him 7 billion, which I think the sum is constantly going up, with Erdogan, another rogue state, repeatedly saying, if we don't pay him more money, I can't stop the people coming. And then you contrast that with Trump on the Mexican border. He was told nothing could be done, the caravans were coming, and he simply said to Mexico, there's a tariff on you until you seal your borders. And within a weekend, Mexico sealed its borders. So I think going back to these weaknesses, they seem to be focusing again on all the politically correct agendas. There is something more substantial to work towards, and they need to address these issues. I was very struck by when Dave said we're not using our voice for good, and I think there's a real problem in that. I mean, we sort of, I do a lot of, I was doing cases in the Caribbean and British overseas protectorates, and Britain is constantly promoting from a Christian point of view, same-sex marriage, no doubt transgenderism, all these things on lands many miles from us with different cultures. And our influence is used in that way often, but not to stand up for the absolute fundamentals of bringing freedom to a lot of the oppressed Chinese and a lot of the oppressed Russians. And that's not just one thing I just want to say before I silence myself. I just remember a few years ago, the great buzz was China's going to be the biggest Christian nation in the world if it goes on like this. And you know what? It may still be. So, you know, you never know where that great country could go once they get rid of the shackles of the Communist Party.
Paul, I mean, there's much talk about in this G7 summit with the US Secretary of State Blinken talking about the renewal of the special relationship between Britain and the United States. And historically, when we look at this special relationship between America and Britain, God has raised up these two powerful nations that had a very strong Judeo-Christian heritage, that God was at the heart of our government. So we can meet the challenge posed by the expansion of German imperialism during the First World War. We see that our two nations came to the fore in confronting and defeating fascism and Nazism during the Second World War. And again, we see that our alliance played a major role in defeating the Soviet Union in the Cold War and stopped Soviet expansionism further into Europe. But if it's not based on our Judeo-Christian values, what is the special relationship based upon today, in your opinion?
Well, I think we do have a special relationship because of historical factors, that we are bonded together by language, culture, and similar values. And you're right, the special relationship was terribly important, and it's always been very important because it's stood in a much more robust way than many other world powers for forces of good. And so it's tried to stop German imperialism in 1914. Britain at one point was wholly alone, standing up against the Nazi menace, and we bankrupted ourselves and damaged our economy. And even in the Iraq wars, it was a sort of an Anglo-American venture. We were the sort of rock of standing on values. And I think although the world attacks it, they're envious of it and they know it's important, and actually they're grateful for it. And if there is any German expansionism in the EU, which they may be, I think the fear of many EU countries was Britain not being the counterweight to Germany on its departure. So what is it based on? Well, I think that it is getting very weak. As I said, we've discussed our internal values. As you said, free speech is very damaged in Britain. We've got cancel culture. If you say something somebody doesn't like, which isn't politically correct, you are destroyed. If you say something abusive and offensive, which is approved, it's that suddenly free speech comes into full effect. So it's clear that we need to work together to address some of the fundamental issues, but our values are very confused. We are promoting global warming, and that seems to be the #1 priority. Meanwhile, China is breaching international law right, left, and center, has reparations to pay. We've got the Uyghurs, but as Dave has mentioned, a lot of Christians are persecuted, and a lot of these countries, Turkey, Iran, need to be stood up to. And these are very difficult decisions to make.
And Dave, there was a time that Britain and the United States of America were the nations that spread the gospel around the world. They defended Christian liberties around the world. They confronted tyranny. But now we see there's a different agenda that Britain and the United States are based upon, considering that our nations are now post-Christian. We haven't got any values of ourselves anymore that made that alliance strong, because it was built on that Judeo-Christian heritage. So how does Britain meet those challenges when we ourselves are in a massive moral and spiritual vacuum, and the same in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's the real crux of the matter, is that we don't know what our identity is. How can we promote those values around the world? How can we promote truth and liberty around the world when we don't understand it ourselves, when we've rejected it ourselves? I was reflecting yesterday about how Israel and Judah, and they led each other off into wickedness, and really that's been the situation for America and the UK, because we've gone and followed each other and moved further and further away from the truths of God, the understanding of truth. We have become like Pilate, saying, "What is truth? The truth holds no value. That it's all relative." And then, so what do we have to offer to the world? What is it that we have to promote? All we see in other nations is that they can deceive, that they can put out their own agenda and their own ideas that are untrue, that are deceptive. They talk about that they're going to deal with misleading information from these nations, as if we don't put out misleading information ourselves. And the idea of truth and liberty seems to have gone here to a great extent compared to what it was. And when we look back at the ideology we were fighting in communist Russia, and we look at our values now and how our education system is, and how our media is, we see so many comparisons to what we understood before. And so we really do need to recover that, and we do need to return. And as Christians, we need to pray for the return of that, because without that standard in the world, there is so little of righteousness promoted in the world.
And Paul, we saw that America's previous president, President Trump, stood up for Israel. He created, as you said, 5 major peace agreements in the Middle East with the Sunni world. We also saw that he defended Christians facing persecution. And yet when we look at President Biden, he struggles to put even more than 2 sentences together. We know that he struggles even walking up to Air Force One. He looks very unstable, and he doesn't project strength. And so anyone that is probably Chinese or Russian or even Iranian would actually think that, Biden, the United States, they're no threat or match to us. Isn't there a great danger that with him as president, we are seeing the world in a more precarious, dangerous situation, as we see that America is weak and has a weak leader in power?
Yes, well, I think it is a real problem. However the die is cast, the reality of the matter is the United States is a leader of the free world, and the United States has to take a robust position, whether you like that president or not. And certainly in previous presidents, there was very often a robust position, or you knew you could stand on them. Biden is, I believe, an incredibly weak leader. Personally, he vacillates on decisions. He's clearly making politically correct decisions. He remakes decisions if there's too much criticism of him. He's been unable to, I believe, stamp his authority, and he seemed to have no base. His State of the Union address had a mere 11 million viewers in the United States. It's unheard of low figures, and he's clearly got no popular support despite his purported significant election victory. So, I mean, just take the weakness in the Iran deal. I mean, they're talking of lifting sanctions as a terms of entering the negotiations. Well, you couldn't be more stupid. The sanctions are your leverage for the negotiations. And just think of the position. Iran is hungry for this deal. They are hurting. Trump's sanctions must have driven that country more steps down than it's been for years. And I don't believe China or Russia can support them. Imagine if he said, term of the deal, religious liberty. Open those prisons. We want 25 Iranian Christians released if you sign that deal. We want Americans to go into that country, not arrested on jumped up charges. And you can put a few Radcliffes of British people in there as well. Why don't they do that? They're desperate, but they're going to give them a sweet little deal. but everybody knows is not going to be enforced. There'll probably be a first strike by Israel to stop something happening, and then we really will be plunged somewhere.
And Dave, as an intercessor, how can we pray for Britain and the United States, knowing that both our nations were once global players, and not only that, but projected strength that came from the foundation, which was our Judeo-Christian heritage?
I think particularly to pray for the media, what we've seen in the media and the way they control politicians. And Johnson's been the first prime minister who's really stood up to a media backlash. Paul was talking there about how Biden vacillates, where Boris Johnson has been criticised for not changing his mind, for sticking to his guns repeatedly in the media. And he's with him and Trump in power, they were the first time for some time that leaders have stood up. And so we do need to pray for strong leaders with courage. Of course, we want them to stand on the right issues. And again, Boris Johnson's talked, and we've got the Bishop of Truro kind of looking into persecuted Christians. But are we going to give that report teeth? Is there going to be a response to that report? We need to pray for these things. We need to pray for us to recover truth. And whenever truth is promoted, the media are jumping all over it. Whenever someone takes a stated position, whether it's Liz Truss, she's been denigrated in the media for her stand on matters, and you can well document it. Whenever someone talks about Christian freedom, they are attacked. We've seen the Reform Party blocked by the BBC from debates. There's an agenda, and really the hearts and minds of the nation is being driven by the media, and we really need to pray about it. We really need to seek God for a change in the media. And there is a new news channel coming, GB News. We'll see if that has an effect, because unfortunately so much of the change that we're seeing for bad in our nation has come from the media driven agenda.
Excellent. So, Paul and Dave, thank you so much for being my guests on this home edition of Politics Today. I want to thank you for watching this program today, as we discussed how our own Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has hosted the G7 summit for foreign leaders made up of the G7, and how it's important that we need to continue to pray and intercede for our nation and the United States, that our nations would turn back to God, and that is where they draw their moral strength and courage to meet the global challenges that we face today. So thank you for watching this home edition of Politics Today.